One of my favorites, Jack Benny.
And Jack Benny.
Jack Benny.
Oh, thank you, Jack.
I'm mad about you too, Jack. Jack Benny!
Would you welcome, please, Jack Benny?
I have a theory that Jack Benny is the father of modern comedy. Just look at all the greats who were inspired by him, and all the comedians inspired by those people.
Jack Benny, I'm a huge fan, and you were a huge fan, massive influence, and he influenced so many people, Johnny Carson, yourself, just a whole generation of comedians who then influenced another generation of comedians.
Whether they know it or not. And I say modern history because really before vaudeville, comedians' acts didn't go on the road. Jack was one of the first comedians to make the big time. Frank Fay is sometimes seen as the first stand-up comedian, and Jack Benny is thought to have taken some of his mannerisms and persona after Frank Fay kind of fell into obscurity. The reason why he fell into obscurity is because, well, his stand-up act wasn't really an act. He kind of was an unlikable person, just as much on the stage as off. He was an alcoholic and a wife beater. He wasn't very well regarded, and he is sometimes thought to be the inspiration for A Star is Born due to his marriage with Barbara Stanwyck. But it would be a mistake to say that this act was totally lifted, that Jack had no part in it. No, Jack did create his own persona on the stage, and he was very talented, and many comedians will say that you can't teach timing, and Jack Benny definitely had timing. Jack also had a way of lifting others up, which is kind of hard to do when you're kind of a douchebag off stage. So I think part of the durability of Jack is just how willing he was to work with others.
Ronald Coleman was on the show, and they're sitting around. It's a table read, and they're just reading the script, and Jack does a line. He said, give that to Dennis Day. He said, that's a better line if Dennis says it.
Right.
And then they read some more, and then he said, give that to Phil Harris.
Mm-hmm.
So they're through with the table read, and Ronald Coleman said to him, he said, that was amazing. He said, you gave away some of the best material
To other people.
And Jack said, but I'll be back next week.
It wasn't long before the pro vaudevillians were getting their own radio shows. Jack Benny, Burns and Allen, Fred Allen, Bob Hope, and Jimmy Durante. Even Edgar Bergen, a puppet ventriloquist act. How that makes sense over the radio, I don't know. But some of those listening would become some of the most influential comedians of all time.
Here he is, Johnny Carson.
He loved Jack so much, he did his thesis in college about joke writing for radio, using many examples from Jack's program and Fred Allen.
The comedy gag writer is truly a forgotten soul. But if you don't mind being forgotten, have a terrific sense of humor, and what's more important, can put it down on paper, the top comedians are waiting right now with check in hand. Now let's drop in on the Jack Benny Show, one of the big consumers of the running gag.
Johnny Carson would even say Jack was his comedy idol. When Johnny was a rising star, he got a part in Jack's program and showed just how much he was influenced by Jack.
I lie awake and wish that I could grow up to be just like you, Mr. Benny.
Well, you can call me Jack.
Thank you, Jack. And even when I watch you on television today, during your own shows, I know that I'm watching a genius, a master at work.
Well, now, wait a minute. Now that's a little bit embarrassing.
Well, then I won't go on.
Oh, no. You can go on. You know, you're my guest. You can say whatever you like.
Jack, and I want to tell you that I never miss one of your television shows.
You watch all of them?
Every single one of them.
Well, isn't that nice?
And Jack, Jack,
Yes?
would you mind if I made a few little suggestions?
Suggestion? I see.
Now, fortunately, that also can be easily corrected.
Oh, well, that's fine then. Well, if you're through now...
Well, there is one more thing.
Well, then tell me. I mean, don't keep anything away from your idol. Out with it.
Well, as long as I'm being constructive, Jack, this I have to tell you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you may not realize this, but every move you make, your delivery, every little inflection that you have is exactly the way I work, and I don't think it's fair. See, you're staring again.
Carson is important to Jack's comedy legacy because Carson was on Nightly and made the late night show format what it is today. So he inspired other comedians like David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, and Craig Ferguson, who are on Nightly, so people get to see them all the time. Carson was also important by the sheer volume of guests and years he racked up on television. Even if a comedian didn't list Carson as an influence, many comedians of that era will tell you Carson could make your career. If Carson called a comedian to be beside him on his couch, your name was suddenly known across the country. And if that was your first time on the show, you were made. Only a handful of comedians ever did that. But off the top of my head, Jerry Seinfeld, Drew Carey, Ellen DeGeneres, and Stephen Wright.
And all this stuff had happened to me. I got this development deal. I got money. My debts are gone. All my club money went like way up through the roof. And I was like, finally, I can make a good living. I mean, I was making an okay living, but like finally, I'm making like money like my friends in college are making. And, you know, I'm a professional now. He really did kind of like hand the keys to the kingdom to me, pretty much. So I just wanted to shake his hand and tell him thanks.
Bob Newhart.
Also friends with Carson. And Carson influenced the comedic style of the day. He was the tastemaker, the kingmaker. And as we saw earlier, Carson was heavily influenced by Jack Benny. Bob Newhart is accused of also lifting his style of pauses from Jack Benny. And many comedians of the day will list Bob Newhart as a huge influence. Now, he definitely got some of his comedic timing from Jack. He acknowledges just how good Jack was at that, and that he was fearless.
So you will take the time, and there'll be a long pause, and that was such an important part of your record when it first came out. And then I know that you had some problems because one of the engineers, I guess, thought that he could improve the record, right?
Yeah, I made the album, and then they figured, well, there's some silence. We can save some time there. So step, and it drove me nuts because
Right.
it wasn't the way
It wasn't you, and it wasn't
the
what
way
made you
I
distinctive.
did it. Yeah. I've been compared to Jack with my timing. I don't think you can teach timing. I think timing is something it's like a metronome in your head. Jack was the bravest comedian I have ever seen work.
I wrote a paper in college about how Seinfeld changed television comedy, but that's for another time. Not what I set out to do with the paper. It changed television comedy to what it is today. Before, we had characters that didn't develop, and Seinfeld kind of took that model and just made fun of it. And so now comedy and comedians on sitcoms kind of have to have some character evolution. So in that way, Jack has inspired people like Jerry Seinfeld, who have in turn changed the way sitcoms are seen today. But Jack also inspired Steve Martin. Steve, as most stand-ups will agree, was the first big stand-up. He took it to a new level. He toured the country, stadiums, like a concert. That was a new phenomenon. Most comics performed at clubs or bars, casinos, if you made it to the stands. Now, Steve lists Jack as an influence on him. His timing, his use of using other players for laughs.
And we would listen to Jack Benny on the radio, who I believed influenced me a lot. I think he influenced Johnny Carson quite a bit. His timing, he was self-deprecating. He was kind of vain. And I realize today how much of those qualities of Jack Benny crept into especially my modern day performing, meaning currently now.
Take a look at these circles of influence. Jack is transitively still influencing our culture. John Mulaney is one of the biggest stand-ups today. Conan, as you can see, has a lot of people he is now influencing. Several comedians also cite Rodney Dangerfield as an influence on them. Dangerfield has won the UCLA Jack Benny Award, and you may say that doesn't show he was influenced by Jack, but his name was even taken from a Jack Benny program. Jack Benny threw out a random name on a Christmas broadcast.
Oh, Jack, speaking of your party, what are you going to serve for dinner? Turkey, goose, or duck?
Ham hocks and not another word about it. Come early, Don. You know, a lot of big movie stars are going to be there.
Movie stars? Name one.
Now, there'll be lots of them.
Come on, name one.
Oh, they'll be there.
Don't stall. Name one movie star that's going to be at your party.
All right, Rodney Dangerfield. I know he's coming because he already sent me a wire by Western Union.
Western Union I heard about, but who was Rodney Dangerfield?
And there is some dispute about whether someone suggested the name to Dangerfield, but either way, Dangerfield was associated with people who listed Jack Benny as an inspiration. Earlier, we heard how Jack was known for sharing the spotlight, and he lifted his companions up. Whether it was Phil Harris, who my generation would recognize him more for his voice acting work in several classic Disney movies.
I'm Abraham DeLacy, Giuseppe Casey, Thomas O'Malley, O'Malley the alley cat.
Look for the bare necessities, the simple bare necessities. Forget about your worries and your strife.
Oh, come on, Robbie. Climb the castle walls. Sweep her off her feet. Carry her off in style.
Or whether it was the voice acting of Mel Blanc, who voiced tons of Warner Brother characters and Hanna-Barbera characters. The man of 1,000 voices served as an example for voice actors even today. So how does a 27-year-old find Jack Benny today? I was actually 17 when I found Jack, so 10 years earlier. I loved comedy, particularly late-night comedy. Conan was my favorite. Conan had an appreciation for the classics like Carl Reiner and Johnny Carson. He said it made him want to be a writer, and I too became a writer. If you have an opportunity for writing, please reach out to me. Give myself a little plug there. But I could tell Conan was heavily influenced by Johnny Carson. At that time, Johnny Carson's shows were not airing on antenna TV, so I had to buy a DVD with a couple of Carson's shows, and it had some of Jack's shows on it too. But I just ignored Jack's shows. What? Until I happened to pick up a book of Bob Newhart. He briefly mentioned Jack and getting him to laugh. It was at this point that I was like, I've heard a lot about this Jack Benny fellow lately, because I had also heard a comedian I also admired, Steve Martin, mention Jack. So I decided to go to the original, right to the source, and learn how to be a comedian from the OG, the master himself. And I asked others who inspired them in their comedy on Facebook. Many people listed people I trace back to Jack. I think that's how you keep young people interested. You say, hey, your favorite performer was influenced by this person. So where can we see Jack Benny's influence? A comedian mastering the pause. Jack Benny. Jokes heavily dependent on years of running gags. Jack Benny. I asked other performing friends of mine how Johnny Carson and Steve Martin have influenced them, and here are their responses.
Steve Martin, to say he's been an influence on me is an understatement. I fell in love with his comedy when I was a kid. Although the very first time I ever saw him, I was not a fan. I was a small child, and I saw him in the Muppet movie, where he played a rude waiter to Kermit and Piggy on their very first date. And I didn't know who that man was, but he was not being very nice to my beloved Miss Piggy. I didn't know years later that exact kind of shtick of the angry waiter or the irritated persona that he puts out, the wrongly misplaced frustration, is going to be one of my favorite bits that he does. Steve Martin's comedy kind of transcends that side of I'm just kind of an idiot, you're laughing at me, or I'm kind of leading and I'm in control of the situation. He's able to walk that line, and over the years, whether he's in The Jerk or Dirty Rotten Scoundrels or Bowfinger or Father of the Bride and many others, he's able to walk a really interesting line of comedy. I think that's always what reached out to me, and part of that is he's so very carefully flips the switch and throws it around without being too obvious or anything. And I think that's one of my favorite things that he does with his comedy, is where he leads you out in one direction and he changes it. And it's not just, other comedians do this too, and not just the misdirect, but he does it in a way that you're laughing at him, with him, and then suddenly he's taking you somewhere else, but it just feels great. It makes you laugh. His influence, one of his influences was Jack Benny and his subtlety, that dry, deadpan look to the camera. And Steve applied that to his comedy. While a lot of people would think, well, that's not really it. He was doing a lot of broad stuff in the 70s and early 80s when he would do his comedy, but he would still do those pensive looks of sophistication that looked like definitely were inspired by Jack Benny. But again, he made it his own. I appreciate Steve Martin and him sharing his talents from comedy to music. It's led me to career choices and things that I have got to do and people I've got to be friends with that I would have not known otherwise. So I owe a whole lot to that guy. I've had the fortune to get to meet him a couple times, but I hope that he doesn't remember, or else I'm probably on some kind of a watch list.
And now, this.
And now, local news cannot be trusted with St. Patrick's Day.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm just gonna lay here for a little bit.
Oh, yeah. I got your glasses.
Moving on.
Hi, I'm Mark Malkoff. I am the host of the Johnny Carson themed podcast, The Carson Podcast. And as most of you know, Jack Benny was Johnny Carson's comedy hero. He learned so much from Jack Benny. He studied Jack Benny. And some of the things that Carson really took away were timing, the ability to edit material, especially sketches, Johnny said, pauses with silence. If you look at Carson, that was total Jack Benny, and just reaction shots in general. I mean, Jack Benny could get the biggest laugh on a reaction. You can totally tell Carson took some of that. Jack Benny was near and dear to Johnny Carson as a friend. When Jack Benny died, Carson was actually at the house. That's at least what I heard. And Carson's wife at the time later said that it was one of the only 2 times that she ever saw Carson cry. So that speaks volumes about what Jack Benny meant to him. In terms of how Carson has influenced me, I would say with my Carson podcast, I would definitely say listening. I really try to listen to my guests, not interrupt. I will say things, but the most important thing is for my guests to shine. I don't need to chime in to get a laugh. My job is to make my guests look good, for them to shine, and I step away and I let them do their thing. I don't need to be the center of attention. And when Johnny was doing the interviews, that was totally him, and I tried to take that to what I do. There were so many comedians that were influenced by Jack Benny. Definitely Steve Martin, and definitely, of course, Johnny Carson. And then you look at the comedians that took from Carson. Definitely Bill Maher, when he does his monologue he's always doing Carson. He's doing the Carson posture. That is 100% Carson if you look at the tapes. And definitely, I would say reaction shots, like Conan O'Brien during his tenure would always, for the reaction, stare into the camera blankly, and just like Carson. I mean, it was like textbook Carson. And I'm sure Conan would admit that. Maybe it was an homage to Carson, but that was definitely, and I would say reaction shots from Ellen DeGeneres as well echo that. And I remember Ray Romano in the PBS American Masters series talking about how Carson really helped him out with pauses and the timing of his comedy. So it all goes back to Jack Benny. I am so excited for this first virtual convention. Congratulations.
So you see, Jack's influence continues on. Now, this genealogy of comedy doesn't work for everyone. Women in black comics are less likely to be traced back to Jack Benny, but most comedians who are in the mainstream still today can be traced back to Jack's influence. Jack did help Rochester, or Eddie Anderson, to become one of the most popular black characters and well-paid radio actors of that time.
Oh, Rochester! Yeah, boy!
This is a time when black characters were being played by white voices. But talking about race and radio is another TED Talk entirely. If you like this video, please be sure to like, comment, or share. It really helps me continue to make this content. Thank you for watching.
We're a little late, so good night, folks.